Good morning, everyone. I call this meeting of the Public Accounts Committee to order. We have with us this morning the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Service Effectiveness. Let's start with introductions, beginning with Mr. Horn.
Thank you. My name is Bill Horn. I'm MLA for Waverley, Fall River, Beaverbank.
MLA Suzanne Lonis-Croft, Lunenburg.
Benjamin Jessam, Hammonds Plains, Lucasville.
Joachim Strong, Halifax, Shabukto.
Ian Rankin, Timberley Prospect.
Good morning, welcome. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
Good morning, Dave Wilson, MLA for Sackville-Cobequid.
Alan McMaster, MLA for Inverness, your chair. We also have with us this morning our Auditor General, Mr. Pickup. Okay, let's also our guests will introduce themselves and give you some time for some opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Fred Crooks. I'm Chief Regulatory Officer for the province, and I lead the Office of Regulatory Affairs and Service Effectiveness. And with me is Leanne Hashie, who's an Executive Director in our office and who has a significant leadership capacity in the regulatory initiatives that our office is overseeing. So I do have with your permission, Mr. Chairman, a few opening remarks, which I'll try and keep brief. So we're obviously delighted to have the opportunity, Mr. Chair, to be here to provide you with an overview of the work of our office. We're just under 2 years into our mandate, and put simply, our job is, with the help of both business and our colleagues in government, to find practical, workable ways to cut red tape and to reduce the cost of doing business in our province and our region, to make our region stronger economically and a more competitive marketplace, given the which is a good objective for any jurisdiction, but given the fiscal and demographic challenges that the Atlantic region faces, our mandate, we believe, has a more added urgency than might otherwise be the case. The Joint Office was established initially by the governments of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in March of 2015, and in November 2015, Prince Edward Island joined the fold, so we were then fully maritime. And Newfoundland and Labrador has joined in the office. We've been working with them informally. They liked what they saw and decided that they would like to have full membership in the office, and they joined in December of this past year. So it is now truly an initiative that's Atlantic in scope. I think all 4 provinces see the potential and the benefit of a shared approach to regulatory reform and modernization, both for the individual provinces and collectively. So again, in general terms, recognizing that this is an overview and maybe a bit of an introduction to the office for some members of the committee, I'll keep my brief remarks fairly basic at the outset and then let the questions that you have define the agenda. So the first sort of major aspect of our office's role is leadership in this space. And we've, in that regard, led the adoption of principles to guide our regulators and to act as lead agency in ensuring culture and practice within governmental institutions and in the relationship between government and business that are consistent with regulatory goals. And those principles are reflected in the Charter of Governing Principles for Regulation, a copy of which I think is available in the package that was circulated to the committee. But without going through that in detail, the core themes really are in developing regulation, to make sure that there's a clearly articulated policy need at the outset. Know the problem you're trying to solve. Sounds like common sense, and it is common sense, but not always common in practice. The second principle is that regulation should not be a first resort. It should be something there are circumstances, obviously, where regulation mandating a course of conduct or a course of behavior or requirement is appropriate. But it should not be, when there's a policy problem identified, it should not proceed in a regulatory form, kind of on a knee-jerk or, well, let's write something and enact it basis. And regulation, once you've concluded, once a regulatory body has concluded that mandatory regulation is required, the principles suggest, and these principles, by the way, have been adopted by the premiers of all 4 Atlantic provinces, as we'll mention, as a kind of framework for the office's work and for the work of government, the regulatory work of government. But regulation, if it's enacted, should be the lightest possible touch, should be based on a solid cost-benefit analysis, to be based on transparent and consultative process, so meaningful consultation early and at periods during the development process. And the other principle, which is important to the Atlantic nature of the initiative, is that government should proceed with a mindset across the Atlantic region that new regulation, where possible, should be aligned across the Atlantic, so that we don't continue to contribute to the patchwork of regulation that exists in the various provinces. The office also facilitates burden reduction initiatives with departments and agencies in priority areas, both within the province and across Atlantic governments. The second main role that the office has is advisory to departments of government on proposals for new regulation or changes to regulation. And in that capacity, policy-wise, we're really neutral. We're agnostic on the policy direction, the purpose, the fundamental purpose, if it's clearly articulated, or the policy direction. Our role really is to provide advice as to whether the means that have been proposed of dealing with the policy initiative are consistent with the Charter of Principles that I've just mentioned, and in addition, that there's an understanding, a fairly robust understanding, estimate though it will be, of the cost that the proposal will incur for businesses who are subject, particularly businesses who are subject to the regulation. And that's a piece of information. It's one of the significant drivers of an office like ours. That's information that hasn't always been available, at least not in a systematic way in the past. Government has fairly consistently understood the cost of proposals to government itself, but not have a sense of the cost to the regulated community. The third sort of role of our office has been to develop and implement an approach to measurement, which is critical to the credibility of the initiative and the accountability ultimately of our office and of government for making progress in terms of achieving a reduction in regulatory burden. And to do that, we've spent a fair amount of time in our first year developing a tool for estimating the costs of regulatory proposals. And we can, if there's interest, we can chat more about that. Fundamentally, it's based on what's called the standard cost model, which is a model widely used among OECD countries, particularly in Europe and in Australia, and to some extent in Canada. So it's a tried and true methodology. It's not perfect, but it's well respected. And finally, our office, if you look at our name, it's Regulatory Affairs and Service Effectiveness. We've got a service component to our mandate. And frankly, one of the things after 2 years that we've discovered in depth, more in depth than I think I would have expected coming into the role, is that when businesses talk about red tape, businesses large and small, but it particularly bears on small business, they're talking sometimes about service. and getting access to government and getting support in terms of really good quality customer service. And that's one of the most significant areas, we believe, for attacking and reducing regulatory burden. And interestingly enough, very, very few other jurisdictions internationally have made service a priority as a part of administrative simplification. In that regard, we recently launched a service called the Business Navigation Service, which is a one-year pilot run from our office, and the sole purpose of that is particularly focused on small and medium businesses, is to help them navigate the regulatory maze that has to be navigated in starting a business or trying to cope with regulatory requirements on an ongoing basis, particularly if you're a small business. Again, we can chat further about that. Our office reports on an annual basis. Our second annual report will be published in June of this year. I think you have a copy of the report that we published last year. We're getting on in our mandate. Our act expires automatically unless it's renewed by the House after 5 years, unless it's determined that we continue. So we've got a fairly finite time to make a difference, and we're very conscious of that. We're also a small group, so we're really we're trying to make a difference in a short time. So just to summarize some of our results to date, or some of the areas where we've worked, which may be helpful. There may be questions on some of these. The business navigation pilot, which I've mentioned. The regional thing is really important in the sense that I see I'm over my 5 minutes. So, Mr. Chairman, you can shut me down wherever you. I'm happy to take your direction on that. I've got another few minutes, but if the. One of the things that we think is significant is the fact that right across the Atlantic region, we've got, and we've spent some time on this, we've got one charter of principles for regulation that all provinces have adopted, which is important in the sense of trying to get over the patchwork of regulatory programs, often programs that are not intentionally or deliberately different, but just because as time goes on, the provinces don't necessarily look to each other as models, and the same policy purposes are served by significantly different administrative requirements. So we're very pleased and proud of the fact that of the provinces for having said, you know what, we're serious about this to the point that we're going to adopt the same principles, we're going to adopt the same act. Basically, there's mirror legislation in the 4 Atlantic provinces, and we're going to, beyond that, we're going to commit to using the same model for measuring actual reductions to regulatory burden, which is so on the regional front, we're pleased about that. An example of a few changes, and this, you know, the thing about this job is there's no sort of one fell swoop. It's a lot of incremental changes that are raised, many of them by small businesses themselves. People are saying, look, this is crazy, this is intolerable, this is asphyxiating, and we want to have an ear for that. We have ideas about a more comprehensive approach in the longer term, which we can talk about. But for example, the timing of minimum wage changes. There was a strong feeling that if we weren't going to standardize minimum wages across Atlantic Canada, then at least we should standardize the timing so that businesses that operate across the jurisdiction are doing this at the same time. In procurement, you know, we have the Atlantic Agreement on Procurement that was put in place in, I think, in the 90s, and those procurement agreements sound good when you do them, and the principles are great. The problem is when you get underneath them and find out what actually has changed. For example, every jurisdiction has had different terms and conditions, different format for its procurement documents. One of the things was identified to us by business makes it really difficult and costly to do business in the 4 provinces. So we've tackled that, and in fact now have for the goods and services portion of procurement, we've got aligned documents for construction. That's coming, I think, the middle of this year. The 4 provinces are in the process of adopting the Canada Revenue Agency's One Business Number to make it easier for businesses to register and work with workers' compensation. We're in the process of mutually recognizing head and foot protection across the Atlantic region so that a hard helmet certified by the Canadian Safety Association can be worn in any Atlantic province. We've standardized, or we're in the process of standardizing, we heard this in spades from the trucking industry, the carrier profile for the trucking industry, a kind of report card, so that trucking companies don't have one score in one province and a different score in another province, which affects insurance and bidding and all the rest of it. And we're moving from from 4 provincial licenses for occupations and activities like elevator technicians and amusement ride technicians and others to 1 regional license. So these initiatives are not, I want to emphasize, they're not our initiatives. They're initiatives that in some cases we've facilitated, but there are technical teams in each of the departments, in each of the governments across Atlantic that are working together on this. I guess let me end with one, I think, core insight. First of all, this is a world of trying to staunch the death of 1,000 cuts. And it's sometimes hard. It's a long-term exercise, and it's sometimes hard to sustain momentum and see progress and for people to feel it, but the work is real. The second thing is, even though it's the accumulation of a whole lot of smaller irritants that really, and including service, that constitutes the real burden to business of red tape. The Atlantic Provinces Economic Council has estimated in a recent report that if in the maritime provinces alone, 10% of the trade barriers that still exist among the maritime provinces were eliminated, that would have a value to the maritime economy of something in the order of 1.2, 1.3% of GDP, or about $1 billion. That's 10% of the constraints that are there. So we're approaching this from the point of view that, yes, red tape is about simplification. Yes, it's about incremental things, but there's a significant economic opportunity there for our province and for our region. I look forward to your questions, and I apologize for going over time.
Thank you. We'll start with the PC Caucus and Mr. Houston for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for those opening comments. They certainly weren't amongst the briefest we've heard in here, but they were interesting. So I do appreciate that, because it's an important topic. It is something. I mean, when we talk about red tape, and a lot of people might not really understand what red tape is to the normal person that is on the street. But some regulation is good. Some is garbage, right? So we need to get rid of the garbage stuff that frustrates businesses and frustrates development. And I know that's what you're trying to do, but I'm just not exactly clear on the focus of the office in terms of the regional cooperation versus the kind of internal Nova Scotia specific garbage we have, I guess. What would you say are you more focused as an office on the regional cooperation, or are you more focused on the internal Nova Scotia specific stuff, or how would you characterize the split of your effort?
Mr. Crooks?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Houston. On a percentage basis, I would say I would estimate that the regional focus, there are only 8 of us in terms of the regional focus is probably 40%, and the balance within province focus is 60%. So the regional focus, and Leanne, who leads our work in terms of regional initiatives, could describe some of them. But we have, basically, we're constantly working with Nova Scotia and other Atlantic teams on an agenda of initiatives. I would say that takes about 40% of our time. Then the balance is spent, it's mostly internal. It could have some Atlantic benefit, but for example, the navigator system and the service initiatives, those are provincial. They may, other provinces might decide to model them, and the targets for reduction of burden, those are internal to Nova Scotia. Again, they might roll out to the other provinces, but the primary focus there is internal to Nova Scotia.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's interesting because there probably hasn't been a government in history that didn't campaign or champion red tape reduction. And probably every single one of them, we'll probably hear it very soon. Premier McNeil will probably be on a campaign trail saying how successful he's been at reducing red tape, and he'll be just like every former premier before him. They're all saying that, and yet here we sit in 2017, the CFIB released a report that asked small business owners, how satisfied are you with the current government's efforts to reduce red tape? And it was a shockingly high number. I think it was in the order of high 50% of businesses that said they're not satisfied. They don't believe that the efforts, because they're not feeling it, right? So what would you say to those people? Like when would they start to feel it?
Well, thank you for the question. A couple of thoughts come to mind. One of the biggest single challenges of this area is to get a measure of progress, a quantitative measure of progress, like dollars reduced, and that demonstrates actual initiatives that translate into savings for business. So and it's got to be a quantification that businesses and representatives of business organizations and the public service recognize as real and credible. So that's point number one. But point number two, which really goes to the question that you're asking, is if you reduce the burden, you estimate the reduction of burden at 5 million or 10 million, or how does that get felt? Well, the truth is, it might not get felt, certainly in the short term, because the distribution over the number of businesses is broad. So they might not, they might actually have some savings. It may be bigger in one sector than the other for a particular year, but they might not really feel it. And that's why we think the qualitative part of assessing our performance is really important. So dollars aside, and it's important to have an objective measure like dollars, but dollars aside, one of the things that we did was we went out to businesses and surveyed them about their level of satisfaction. And what
were your results similar to the CFIB, where it was a very high level of dissatisfaction?
Yeah, there's a high level of dissatisfaction with the relationship to government. I think and I think it's consistent. Frankly, I think as CFIB would say, I can't speak for CFIB, but I think it's consistent in many jurisdictions. One of the things that we're really going to have to focus on, as I say, is the qualitative part of that, where you not only get the numbers and you get a spreadsheet that says, look, this is an estimate, it's defensible, it's not perfect, but it's defensible, it's directionally, we're moving in the right direction. But ultimately, if we're not tracking how people feel, are they feeling it? Are we getting at the pain points? Are we getting at the irritants? Are we getting at the things that are real? Forget about how you quantify that globally. Are we really getting at the stuff that is making life miserable for people who are just trying to run the business? So my answer is, I'm not surprised that there isn't a strong feeling of it's made a huge difference, what's been done to date. And the other thing is, I think in most jurisdictions that have been at this for many years, even on a best practice basis. You know, we're never going to be able to get to the point where, much like in the private sector, in the customer service side, you're never going to get to the point where you can eliminate complaints 100%. But what you can do is number one, get the rate of dissatisfaction materially down, and then have systems and processes in place that allow you to really go at complaints in an aggressive way. And that's what you identify is real. It's a concern, and we're still thinking about how do you measure that? How do you make sure people are
Which
feeling?
is kind of, so
Yeah.
if the point is, and I think the point is valid, that on the qualitative scale,
Yes.
the feel-good scale, people don't feel good about it. People are dissatisfied. Business owners are dissatisfied. They feel like there's a lot of hurdles in front of them.
Yep.
So there hasn't been meaningful progress towards that over successive governments, maybe going back in time, because they just don't feel satisfied with the relationship with government. So I found it interesting that this government and the finance minister took a different approach recently and tried to basically tell people, I know qualitatively you might not feel movement, but I'm going to tell you that there has been. And at the Chamber of Commerce luncheon, he put a number out there. He threw a quantitative, his own assessment of how successful his government has been or will be at reducing red tape, because he said, well, qualitatively, they're never going to, they know it's not true, so when we put a number to it and maybe get some interest here. And I was very interested in that number. He threw a number out of $25 million. You're
Right.
probably familiar with that number.
Yes, I am.
I was seated in the room, and I looked around the room, and there was a lot of smirks and chuckles, because people knew it was just a number. Because qualitatively, they weren't feeling that. I don't know if it was the messenger that was the source of the smirks and chuckles, because there's a lot of disconnect in many ways there too, or the message. It was probably both. The number of $25 million is very interesting. Is that a number that you were familiar with before you heard the minister say it at the
Yes.
chamber? Is it a number that is supportable?
Yes.
Is it a number that you could table something for this committee to look at that says, well, this is where the 25 million comes from?
Well, so I guess a couple of things. One is I wouldn't say that there hasn't been progress, and I don't want to compare what we've done with with programs before. But I think we are building, frankly, and I think if you at least what our stakeholders tell us, and I'm thinking of people like Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the Halifax Chamber, the Atlantic Chamber, the Greater Halifax Partnership, the Federations of Labor, the broad range of businesses who we work with, we hear a lot of support and expressions of
They
satisfaction.
want to believe. Sure, of course they want to believe, right?
Yeah, and I'm not, your question, fundamentally, I agree with where we have to go in terms of
But in
this.
terms of the specific question on the 25 million.
Oh, yeah,
is it-
no, absolutely, I'll come to that, but there were just some things in your question that I wouldn't want to leave the impression that I don't believe I think we're doing the things that are necessary to do to build up the infrastructure and process that will enable, we need both quantitative, demonstrable, as the Chamber and CFIB and other businesses point out, you need those targets, you need those quantitative targets. You also need to go to the qualitative. So on the 25 million, I believe that's an achievable number. It's an aggressive number. There are a number of, if you're interested in the sort of the context for that, I'm happy to provide it.
I'm interested in the specifics of it. Can you give us 10 line items that say, well, 5 million comes from this, and 7 comes from this, and 2 comes from, is it something that you can actually put in front of us?
No, it's at this stage a target. It's been developed. It's been developed on the basis of a number of things, including.
Even a target would have components to it. So
Well,
can we at least?
for example, they'd be I can tell you, in terms of kind, there'd be initiatives a lot like some of the initiatives that you've heard announced to date. So, just by way of example, the car dealerships that no longer have to come to the Registry of Motor Vehicles and can do that online to process the permits. Our economist estimated in consultation with the businesses and the Service Nova Scotia that would produce something like $700,000 a year in diminished cost. There are a range of things like that those are the kinds of initiatives that will make up that 25 million.
Okay.
So
And
it's that kind of thing.
Can we have a summary of those, like a succinct summary?
We have a summary of what's been done, but in terms of that target, that's something that in terms of the content, that is going to be, what are the specific items that's going to be comprised of? There is no list at this stage, but there is a strong sense based on what's happened in other jurisdictions, the size of the burden as it's been estimated by StatsCan in Nova Scotia, as it's been estimated by CFIB, percentages of burden reduction that appear, administrative burden reduction that appear achievable based on the experience in other jurisdictions, and a sense from departments, a very preliminary sense of what, because we've consulted both inside and out preliminarily, of what could be done.
Yeah, but
yeah.
I'm having trouble getting context for it. It just feels like a number to me. Like
no, it's not. It's a number in the sense that it's a target number, but it's a number that's.
But is there math? Is there math behind it?
Yeah,
a bunch of things add up to this, or a bunch of like.
Yeah, well, there's not a list right now that totals up to 25 million. So,
okay.
And it would be premature to have that, frankly, because our whole approach is quantify, make an estimate of what's achievable, commit to it, and along with our stakeholders, identify the specific things that are going to be done in order to implement that.
So you could have picked 125 million,
no,
or you could have picked 5 million.
No, we couldn't because we've got a sense, a preliminary sense, admittedly, we've got a sense of the size of the burden. So internationally, the sort of guidepost for what's achievable in the reduction of burden is probably in the range of 20 to 25% of burden. That's over a period of years. Our sense, it's preliminary, but looking at CFIB data, StatsCan data, our own research, is that the addressable burden in Nova Scotia is somewhere in the vicinity of 225 million.
The addressable burden is
No, the burden,
225 million.
And the portion of that, addressable was actually, I shouldn't have used the word addressable. The total burden is in the provincial, is in the vicinity of 225 million. If you take our businesses believe that up to a third of the time that they spend on compliance-related activity is duplicative or unnecessary. So a third is interesting. If you look at the international standard, it may be 25% of the burden that is capable of being reduced. So what the 25 million would be over a very short period of time, which is the time that the minister announced, would be what we believe is 10% of the burden.
But no way to ever measure whether or not it was. So here's the thing. Here's the thing, though. Just so you understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
4 years ago, the Liberal Party campaigned on a promise of a doctor for every Nova Scotian. Everyone knows about that promise. Through public accounts, the Department of Health has been here numerous times. The new health authority has been here numerous times. I've always been trying to understand, had anyone thought about that? I don't think they thought about it. I think the Premier somebody in the Premier's office said, you know what, that's an emotional topic for people. Let's put something out there. Let's say a doctor for every Nova Scotian. I have the Department of Health here ask them how many doctors would it take for a doctor for every Nova Scotian? We don't know. How many people need? We don't know. There was nothing behind it. It was an emotional, political promise. So now, flash forward 4 years, I'm just asking,
Yeah.
the minister put a number out there, 25 million. My sense right now, after this long of discussion, emotional promise, nothing behind it. That's
Well-
what I feel right now. So that's why I'm asking,
Okay,
can
well-
you show me where the 25 million came from? And if we can't show me where 25 million came from, it's a doctor for every Nova Scotian. It's a magic number. It's something to say.
Well,
That's what I feel like. There's opportunity here to dispel to make me feel better about the 25 million, but if there's no math, then it's just a number.
Well, there is math. I've gone through some of the math with you. What there isn't is, what you're saying is, if you can't show me a list of the specific programs or things that are going to add up to the 25 million now, then this is not achievable.
Well,
And
is the
I-
math,
with
is the
respect-
math, is the math as simple as 25 million is a part of 225 million? It's whatever that is, 10%, I guess.
Right.
And that's what we've identified as we can achieve, 10% of some 225 million. Is that what we're talking about here when 25 million comes
Yeah,
up?
that, consultation with departments, preliminary consultation with departments, and the pace, the work that we've done to date, we know that we have through 6 or 7 initiatives that we've achieved over the last year or so, $2.2 million in Nova Scotia alone in reductions. And that's probably, that 2.2 million is probably 10 to 20%. We don't have the resources to cost everything that's been done, but we believe the number is actually much larger than the 2.2 million. So the experience of the first 2 years tells us, along with international best practice, what's been achieved in jurisdictions that have done this, and the information we have from CFIB and others, and our own research to quantify the size of the burden. We're saying $25 million is achievable. And additionally, it's not a bald promise. In other words, 25 million will be there, trust us. This is something that will need to be measured and will be measured using the costing tool that our stakeholders and public servants have said, we have confidence in this tool to provide numbers that we think are reasonable. So I guess, I can't make any comment on the doctors, but I can tell you this. This is based on my advice. This program is based on my advice. And I'm going to be happy, and I fully expect to come here or anywhere else to show, as we carry through this program, to demonstrate the math based on our costing tool of the reductions that have been achieved. So I don't see this as I'm not a pull on the number out of the air kind of person. I'm accountable for this number, frankly, that's clear, and I have every intention of delivering it, and I believe we can. It's realistic.
Order. Thank you very much. The time has expired. We'll move to the NDP Caucus and Mr. Wilson for 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just quickly, your office, I would assume it's what you would consider arm's length from government. Are you able to talk freely, to maybe criticize or speak up when you see the government bring forward changes to regulation or a policy change that may create more barriers? I know, in the mandate, eliminating barriers on new or existing regulations and services to enhance economic opportunities is kind of your mandate. So do you have that freedom to criticize, to speak up if you see something that the government is doing that goes against kind of the mandate that has been established for the office?
Mr. Crooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've got a kind of a dual sort of role. One of the things that was very important to me at the outset was that there was an initial thought that we might be at a part of a department of government, the Department of Business. I felt very strongly that, in fact, we should be standalone. Because if we're evaluating things that are being initiated in departments, we should stand apart. The other thing is we're a small group, and we could easily get overwhelmed with the management processes that exist in larger organizations. So we are standalone. As a result of that, I believe, a very strong relationship and a level of candor with our external stakeholders that might be harder for other departments to achieve. And in general, yes, I think the expectation is that the office was established by the government, as I understand it, because the government was not satisfied with the state of regulation and the burden that businesses are experiencing. We are completely free to identify in general terms the things that we think are, or might, if they're being proposed, stand in the way of ease of commerce. Now having said that, though, I've got to say this: we also are in a position where we provide advice to ministers and the cabinet on specific proposals, and that advice is it's candid, and it's direct, and it's based on the Charter of Principles, and it's based on cost.
So if you do have some concerns, would you do that in a public manner, or is it just bring it up to the minister? So I look at your office similar to the Auditor General's office, right? They review what's going on, they make recommendations, but of course they have a method of reporting that to this committee.
Absolutely.
So do you do that in any kind of public forum, or would you do it in a public forum?
Well, for example, we're in a different place on the continuum of independence and removal from government than the Auditor General's office. We're not set up, nor do we have that measure of independence or the responsibilities to publish our observations in the same way. And part of that is the reason for that is we're advisors to government. Some of our advice would be within the bounds of cabinet confidentiality. But at the same time, we do have an obligation under our statute to make an annual report. And if the annual report says, I can tell you this, that if in a given year the quantity of regulation burden has gone up as opposed to going down, in our estimate and opinion, that's exactly what we'll be saying. Okay. Now, that might not be convenient, I'm sure, but from the point of view of our office, and I think the concept of our office is, if this is going to work in the long term, this has got to have some credibility based on measurement and based on our saying, independently, we believe that globally, even though we may not be able to talk about specific programs where we've given advice to cabinet or a minister, globally, this is going in the wrong direction. So removed in that sense.
Okay. No, I appreciate that.
But not as far. I wouldn't want to compare ourselves to the Office of the Auditor General.
I don't think anybody can compare yourself to the Office of the Auditor General. No, I appreciate that, because I think it's some of the frustrations my colleague has just mentioned is that, yes, okay, the current government set up the office, but I can't predict the future, but they're not going to be in government forever.
Right.
So I hope that the office continues on to make sure that they hold whoever's in power to account on reducing barriers and red tape, as my colleague said. I mean, every government in the past knows that has been a challenge for businesses, especially small businesses in our community, in our province. So I'm going to go in an area where I don't think too many people kind of connect the dots, I think, on what goes on and how they contribute to the economy of our province. And I want to ask a few questions on if you've had any engagement on this. And that's family physicians who many years ago set up the system to really control their overhead, control where they practice, how they practice, and really, ultimately, they're a small business. They hire clerical staff, they hire professional staff, they hire cleaners, they rent spaces in communities, they own buildings, they rent out buildings. and on and on. They contribute to the economy. And in the more recent last few years, there has been, in my opinion, some barriers put in place that limit the ability for a physician to set up a practice wherever they want in this province. And of course, I'm talking about the ability to get privileges and license to do what family physicians do. Have you had any discussion, have you been involved at all in the changes recently in policy that requires additional approval from the Nova Scotia Health Authority for physicians to set up practices? Because we've seen now, especially more recent, pharmacists who want to expand or are willing to go and get that physician and they've been denied. Long-term care facilities, other physicians who want to expand their practice, and that contributes to our economy, especially in rural communities. So have you had any discussion on those barriers that are being placed on physicians currently, and if you have, could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, no, I can say straight up, no, we have not been involved in that. So this is the first time I'm thinking about this as a regulatory issue. It's an interesting one.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm going to have to take that away. But
Yeah, no, I appreciate,
take it away with note. Okay.
I appreciate the answer. I mean, if you look at the the impact, there is an impact. So I'll have discussions on the other end. Maybe the physicians haven't thought about it, and they have another tool to hopefully tear down some of the barriers.
Right.
I appreciate the answer to that. Of course, the current government ordered early on in their mandate a tax and regulatory review a few years back. That review was headed up by a former Liberal cabinet minister, who later is now appointed to head of Nova Scotia Business Inc. That report made a number of recommendations around regulations. Just wondering, has anything been done with that report? Has your office gone over it? Has there been any changes coming out of that report? I wonder if you could maybe have a response to that.
Sure, absolutely, Mr. Chairman. We knew that the report provided a lot of the context and rationale for the creation of the office. So we've been keeping a very close eye on it and on the recommendations. Again, it's hard to estimate, hard to quantify it. But I would say at this stage we have accomplished about 80% of the recommendations in the report, and the balance are things that are either on our agenda for the coming year, or are things that are sort of outside the mandate of our office. For example, some of the recommendations have to do with digitized service arrangements and dealing with forms that are being worked on. It's not that the points aren't being worked on, but they're being worked on in places like Service Nova Scotia, Internal Services, and Communications Nova Scotia. So we'd be happy. We track this pretty closely. We'd be happy to share with we've prepared a bit of a format comparing the recommendations that were made in the Broughton report with what we've done and where they leave. If that's something that we could furnish to the committee.
Yeah, I don't know if you've watched public accounts, but normally you just answered my second question. Would be could you provide the committee with
Sure.
with that kind of flow chart? Or excellent.
Absolutely, happy to do that.
Good. Do you recall the cost of that report? I mean, it was significant.
I don't.
I think it was about $150,000. But have you been instructed not to move in changing some of the recommendations by the deputy, the minister, the government at all, or have you been just looking at the report and moving forward with it?
I'm a deputy in my area, despite the odd title, and I report to the Premier. So I guess I've been, one thing I can say is I've had no instructions about Broughton or anything else in terms of delimiting what I can look at or what I should look at.
Okay, thank you. Another area that is going to be upon us quite quickly is the legalization of cannabis. We had a federal government that campaigned heavily on moving forward with legalizing it, and what I see now happening is legislative change federally, and pretty much the Prime Minister and the government kind of wiping their hands and saying, provinces, territories, now it's your go. I see this as a nightmare around regulatory requirements. What work has been done in the province, and have you been engaged in that work? I think we're just over a year away from potentially having to have this up and running in our province. So has there been any work, and can you maybe give us some details on what that work entails?
Thank you. We have been engaged. It's early days, the driver on this is the Department of Justice, but there's a cross-departmental group that we're pleased to be part of. Again, our main focus is the regulatory regime the most streamlined that we can have, and does it impose the least cost to business? So we're engaged, and really that's as much as I can tell you really at this stage.
Would distribution of cannabis through the Nova Scotia Liquor Corp make the most sense, since they're pretty much doing that with another substance right now? So there are many rules in place, there's regulations in place, there's a system of distribution in place. Do you have a comment on if that would be potentially the easiest way for us to ensure that there is control? Because I think that's some of the concerns we hear out there is how is this going to be controlled to make sure that it doesn't get into the hands of young people? And there's a huge marketing campaign, I think, on the negative effects of young people using cannabis. So could you comment on that? Would that be, I think, the most appropriate way to get us to the point where in a year and 2 months from now, we're, as a province, are going to have to allow or have cannabis available to the citizens of our province?
Well, thank you for the question. As I mentioned, we stay away from the policy content of this, and there's a policy, that's mixed policy and process. But the main thing I would say is that I'm not well enough informed on that issue to be able to give you a meaningful or even maybe a sensible answer. So I'm going to pass on that. I expect that will be among the questions that will be considered, given that the provinces have responsibility for distribution and sale. One thing I will say is that which could bear on what structure is adopted, is there is some sign that the Atlantic provinces are interested as much as possible in aligning an approach. Now, whether that will happen, how far that will go, it remains to be seen, but that's a principle that we feel very strongly about. But I'm sorry that I can't be more responsive to your question.
I appreciate the openness and being clear on that. I do hope that that is an area that the government will look at, and I would think it's relevant to have your office involved in this, because I do see the need for very strong regulations, and it's one that it's not like you're taking it away from businesses now. It's going to be a new type of thing. So anyways, I appreciate that. Another area that I know more recent, we heard from some business owners was in the Law Amendments Committee. It's around the accessibility bill. And we know that some business owners talked about the regulations required to achieve accessibility as potentially burdensome. And that's their word, not their definition, not mine. Yet those in the community that have been working hard to bring forward legislation want to ensure that human rights are affordable to all people, no matter what their disability is, and we shouldn't be looking at this as a barrier or red tape for businesses. How do you define the balance here? Have you been involved in the discussion, and are you supportive of the government and the move towards ensuring that basic human rights for people with disabilities are met, and that the legislation should be strong? And this is not an area where we should be saying, oh, no, we shouldn't have these barriers in place. Barriers, I guess, would be the wrong term, but we shouldn't be looking upon this as red tape when it comes to businesses because of sheerly just the human rights for people with disability.
I want to be responsive to your question, but a couple of things. Yes, our office was consulted and provided advice, which would be within the bounds of cabinet confidentiality, and so I really can't get into the nature of that advice. The other, safe to say that our focus again, and I don't want to sort of whip a dead horse here, but our focus is really the charter principles and process and potential cost to business, as opposed to, from a policy point of view, is this a good thing? Are these admirable objectives? That sort of thing. So we really are neutral on the policy objective, and that's about as much as I can respond. I'm sorry we're not having much luck in terms of me responding to some of your questions, but that's consistent with our role here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We'll now move to the Liberal Caucus and Ms. Lonis Croft.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. I'm learning more about your office. I was interested to see that you are using the Broughton report. So it's not one of these government reports that are sitting on a shelf getting dusty, and you are going to submit how you are balancing out. So can you give me a little bit more detail about how you are using the Broughton report?
Absolutely, and I'm going to ask my colleague Leanne, who's been tracking this fairly closely, to, if you don't mind, Leanne, to respond to that, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Hashi.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. I guess I'll preface your question or my response by saying that we did very much closely follow the Broughton report, and what's unique or what's interesting about the report itself is that it highlights a path forward to try and avoid the failure or lack of sustainability of past initiatives. As one of the members have stated, past initiatives haven't always had the staying power for lots of different reasons. What the Broughton report outlined was what are those things that could be a difference maker to ensure that this particular effort is sustained over time and does have the impact and the results and the feelability of the business community that past efforts may not have. So some of the recommendations that were made in that report included things like having a standalone office where previous efforts have not had a standalone office. They talked about leadership from the very top. The office does have leadership from the very top, and that's also across all departments as well. It talked about the importance of focusing on measurement. As my colleague Mr. Crooks has mentioned, we've developed a business impact assessment tool so we can measure the cost and savings of regulatory proposals. It talked about ensuring that an initiative on regulatory reform had a focus on service, understanding that service effectiveness does place, or lack of service effectiveness does place a burden on businesses of all sizes. It talked about taking a regional approach to regulatory reform, so it not just being Nova Scotia doing it on its own, but getting the benefits of economies of scales across the region. It talked about setting targets. We have a $25 million target, which we have every intent on accomplishing. It talked about outlining principles, so having some vision for what a good regulatory environment looks like for Nova Scotia, as Fred has mentioned, Mr. Crooks, sorry, as Fred has mentioned, those principles have been adopted not just in Nova Scotia, but across the 4 Atlantic provinces, and that's unique across the country when it comes to regulatory reform. As well, the Broughton Report talked about the importance of enshrining some of those principles in legislation. As you may know, Nova Scotia has its first ever Regulatory Accountability and Reporting Act. And again, that's not just a piece of legislation here in Nova Scotia, it's mere legislation across the 4 Atlantic provinces. So those are all of those pieces that were outlined in the recommendations of the Broughton Report have all been implemented by our office.
Great. So have you been a difference maker?
I would like to think that we're making a difference. I mean, I certainly wouldn't be in my role, nor would any of my colleagues in our very small office be in our role if we didn't think that we were making a difference. We do understand that the burden of regulation is felt in many places, and I should say too, it's not just the province that owns that burden. There are different levels of government that own the burden. There are self-regulating bodies that own the burden. But for our piece that we own, and I think, as Fred had mentioned, many of in the business community would say as well, we are making a difference. Is it fast enough? Is it enough? Does it satisfy us? Absolutely not. I mean, we very much see the regulatory system and its improvement as a significant economic lever. APEC outlined in spades how big that lever is. So yes, we are making a difference. There is much more difference to be made.
So you're a standalone office. Why not just be part of the Department of Business? Like, why a separate, office, separate deputy minister? Like, why has that happened?
Mr. Crooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess for a number of reasons, I felt that was important. Best practice is that whether in the UK, in other parts of Europe and elsewhere, is that for an office like ours, which is really cutting against the grain of much of government, and there's no I don't think better way to describe it. For an office like ours to be effective on a sustained basis, it really needs leadership from the top. So I was convinced that this was an office that really needed to report to the Premier. That's one thing. Secondly, it's a by definition, we wanted a small office. We didn't want it, and it is, we're few in number, and frankly, in a larger organization, private sector or public sector, it's very easy to get swept up in the job of day-to-day management of a department or an agency. And we knew, again, from best practice and our own instincts, that if we were going to we're operating across a pretty broad field here to try and make a difference. And if we were going to make a difference, we were going to have to really be intensely focused on a narrow set of objectives, especially given how short a time we have to achieve them. So our judgment was, taking all of that into consideration, we really did need to be a separate and standalone office, and it is what I think what Commissioner Broughton recommended, and I think it's been based on experience. I think it's been borne out to have been the right call, not only by us but by the departments that we're working with, because it hasn't gotten in the way of having a good dialogue and good relationship with the departments, but there is a distance there, and they know we've got a job to do, which is cross-governmental, and they understand, I think, a little better than if we had been an add-on somewhere else, how central this mandate is, or our mandate, to the government's business and economic priorities.
So you report to the Premier, like, is that weekly? Is it, does he call you up and ask you for a report, or, how much reporting to the Premier do you actually do?
Well, I would start by saying that the Premier, frankly, when he appointed me, and this was of interest to me, and his approach, was that if we're going to do this, we have to have latitude, and we've got to have the ability to do and say some things that, to identify our priorities based on the advice of external stakeholders, not simply based on what internal analysis might suggest. And that's why we look to people like to APEC and to others to help set our priorities, and to do and say some things that may not be, how can I put it, things that might typically come out of an operational department. So lots of latitude. I am in touch with the Premier and the Deputy Minister to the Premier probably once a month.
Okay, good. So you have a 5-year mandate?
Yes, our office actually, we have a 5-year mandate. At the 3-year point, we've got to do a review of
Which
the
is
office.
what, when would that be?
Well, that will be in 2018.
Okay, and a $25 million target?
Right.
Okay, so do you have a draft timeline
Timeline for?
for getting your work done? Or, I mean, if it ceases
yes.
at 5 years, you know, what do you hope to have accomplished within that 5 years? You may get an extension, you may not.
Right. So if if there's no extension, then so you're looking at what's been accomplished in 5 years and what would we aspire to accomplish in 5 years. I think the embedding a process in, first of all, getting a charter of principles adopted across the region, a common approach to regulatory principles is an important thing. That would be, we would hope, enduring. We would hope that the process that we've embedded for the business impact assessment in Nova Scotia and the costing tool would be embedded and utilized as a matter of practice on an ongoing basis without us by departments. And departments, we've made sure to do this, to add that process onto what departments do in a way that they'll be able to handle, they'll be able to deal with it and won't need us necessarily to be involved. We would like to get, we'd like to see even more progress on regional initiatives, and perhaps by that time, maybe some sort of more formal regional body to drive regulatory reform across the Atlantic region, because with the adoption of the pending adoption of the internal agreement on, or the agreement on internal trade nationally, the opportunity for Atlantic Canada is significant to drive that agenda, that bring the barriers down agenda very hard, because Atlantic Canada benefits from internal trade liberalization at twice the rate as the rest of the country because of the significance of trade. So we'd like to make sure that we've got our strong place at the table for the national agenda. And we'd like to know, hopefully our Business Navigator service, that pilot ends this year. If it produces results and demonstrates that, in fact, this is a material help to businesses, then we'd, that's something that we would hope might continue. So those are, if we really bear down on it, what we'd love to leave if the 5-year term is it, we'd love to leave a more rigorous process focused on cost to business in the regulatory review process provincially. We'd like to have a robust program regionally that we could leave, and we'd like to have enhanced service to regulated businesses programs that would be. So that's in in the broadest possible terms, that would be our hope.
Thank you. A couple of times you've mentioned stakeholders. Who are your stakeholders?
I'm going to let Leanne is our as Executive Director, Stakeholder Engagement. So Leanne works closely, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Hashi.
Great, thank you. We have The business community essentially is a primary stakeholder. However, we also engage semi-regularly with the labor community as well. So stakeholders would be business associations, business owners, industry associations, so anywhere and in all parts of the province as well. So chambers of commerce, which includes regional bodies such as the Atlantic Chamber of Commerce, and then local chambers of commerce, so the Halifax Chamber of Commerce, the Pictou County Chamber of Commerce, the Truro and Colchester Chamber of Commerce. All of those groups, all of those, Strait Area Chamber of Commerce. So we are in regular contact with our stakeholders, because what we know from past initiatives is that you really do need the ongoing input and support of the business community if we are going to make a difference and if they are going to feel the difference. And we feel extremely fortunate for the stakeholder group that we've built. In fact, in our annual report, our first annual report in June of 2016, one of the things that we made a point of mentioning is that the annual report wasn't ours alone, it is everyone's. That's how much the business community has been involved in our work.
Okay. One of the questions I get as an MLA, and a lot of it surrounds the Building Code of Canada and how it affects businesses, especially I come from, and I represent two communities that are very much heritage communities, and there's a lot of regulations around maintaining your heritage status. And we have businesses wanting to open up, but they call the red tape, the accessible washrooms, sometimes they can't put a ramp in because of defacing a building or just not having the room. On some of these buildings, they don't even have a driveway. Are you part of that, like trying to resolve this so that we do have accessibility for our citizens, yet, this is a federal legislation. I find it very complicated. Municipalities are left to deal with I call it the fallout, because they're the ones that have to issue the permits to the business owners, yet it's a federal regulation. Like, do you have anything to do with this?
Mr. Crooks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We, not a whole lot, in the sense that the National Building Code, as you indicated, is a technical document that is there's a huge sort of national process for developing those standards, which includes a lot of consultation with the development community and others, and has, to the extent it has regional variations, they're usually based on climate differences and things like that. But I think what you're getting at, so when Nova Scotia looks to adopt its version of the National Building Code, or updated it recently, we were certainly asked, because it was regulatory, to have a look at it, and our main focus was, look, are there things in there that add to what may be necessary in terms of the general principles that are a national standard, and we were satisfied there weren't, and so it's really important to have a national standard for this purpose. So there's a fairly limited latitude for altering the National Building Code itself. There's a defined process for doing it. It's a national process and so on. But I think a lot of the things you're getting at are things that arise out of not necessarily just the building code, but municipal regulation. And we've been, that's an area that, even though it's not directly within our mandate and area of responsibility at this stage, it's an area where we've been working, because we understand business, we're talking about the businesses they kind of generally understand that there's federal, provincial, and municipal regulation, but they're just trying to deal with regulation. So the primary issue for them is not who is it, the primary issue for them is how am I constrained. So what we've been doing, we realized that to be at all successful in our office, we can't focus exclusively on provincial regulation. We've got to be working with our federal and municipal partners to make the experience, particularly for people who are looking for help through our navigation service, for example, to make the experience seamless so that we don't end up just saying, oh, that's federal, you got to go talk to the feds, or that's provincial or municipal, you got to go talk to the local council. We're trying to sort of make the experience more seamless. We've also got as you may know, a partnership with, that we've entered into with HRM, which includes an advisory group that is intended to address issues of red tape at the municipal level. And to do that together, recognizing that, again, there's areas of overlap and conflict between between provincial and municipal regulation, and we want to minimize that as much as we can.
Do you think you could expand that program to rural Nova Scotia?
Yeah, well,
Is that a possibility?
in fact, yes, we've started with Halifax. Okay. Halifax had a particular interest in this, and we wanted to respond to that. But for example, we've recently had a conversation with the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities about exactly that. So we got to be mindful there are only so many of us, and we don't want to be going out saying, look, if we only had 15 or 20 more people, we could probably do this and that.
Okay.
We want to keep to...
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to move on. I only have 2 minutes left. So
Okay,
I want to talk about your regional initiatives because, I see the Premier make announcements. He goes and meets with the regional premiers, and they've made announcements regarding regulatory issues. So obviously that doesn't happen in a one-day meeting. So your department must go in there and do some groundwork before these meetings take place. So what is the process? What happens? What's your role?
Mr. Chairman, I might ask Ms. Hashi.
Ms. Hashi.
Thank you for the question. So just coming back to the Broughton report and even the One Nova Scotia report, those two reports talked about the importance of 4 very small provinces working together to get economies of scale and to make it easier for our businesses to gain access to new markets. The report by the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council said very clearly that our 4 small provinces are more dependent on internal trade than anywhere else in the country. Yet it's more costly for our 4 provinces, our businesses within our 4 provinces, to trade interprovincially because we're very small and fragmented. So to give you an illustration, take a business in Lunenburg. If one of your constituents wanted to access
Order. I'm sorry, but the time has expired for that round, but if you wish to add your answer on at the next opportunity, you can do that if the member wishes at the next round. We'll move back to Mr. Houston, the PC Caucus, for 12 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Has your office been involved in any labor negotiations? Have you advised the Premier on labor negotiations with teachers or any other party?
Mr. Crooks.
No, not our office, no.
Okay. Have you in your capacity personally provided some advice?
Other than run into people in the hall and have conversations, no. Okay. I have no formal involvement in the labor file at all.
Okay, thank you. In October 2015, the Nova Scotia government amended weight and dimension regulations for commercial vehicles, and indicated it was signing a memorandum that would bring Nova Scotia regulations in line with most other jurisdictions. Was that memorandum actually signed? Has there been a memorandum signed that brings the dimension?
I'm not 100% sure if I'm clear about the document, but
Ms. Hashi?
Yeah, I think what you, thank you. I think what you may be referring to is a memorandum of understanding that was signed between Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia to align their weights and dimensions to make long combination vehicles move more freely and less costly from one.
Yeah.
Yes.
So was it something that was, is it done, or was it a concept of something that we'd be working towards? Sounds like it was signed, was it?
Well, I think it was the Department of Transportation that led that, so they would really be the ones to answer that question.
Because it predates your office, I guess.
I think the one that I'm thinking of was signed, I think, in the fall of 2016, or it was announced in the fall of 2016.
Okay. Mr. Crooks?
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Chair, we'll follow up on that to make sure we're talking about this.
Yeah,
Whatever, we want to be, it's
Sure.
just a question of making sure we're clear on which document.
Okay. In 2014, the Builders Lien Act was amended, and this was an amendment. You might be familiar with this one. It has to do with publishing of the substantial completion dates. there's a lot of frustration in the construction industry of, has it been substantially completed? Can I get my pay? And the idea behind the act was that it would be a central place they could go and look at a website and see, okay, that project is substantially complete, I'm due my money. It's a very significant thing to people in that industry. The act passed the legislature. To my knowledge, was never proclaimed. Are you familiar with this situation?
Yes, we are familiar with it, and we have given advice on it. But again, on the basis of advice to a minister, I really can't get into it. But
Okay.
we are familiar with it.
Let me ask you: has it been proclaimed? Have the amendments been proclaimed?
I'd have to. To be honest with you, I don't recall whether it was a matter of the amendments being proclaimed or regulations being adopted, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I'd have to, I can't say for sure yes or no.
Okay.
I think, my recollection is that it was more how was it going to be implemented and the regulatory regime that.
Okay, so your office is aware of it?
Yes,
like
we are.
presumably in a official capacity?
Yes,
Probably
we are.
because people in the industry are
Yes, we are.
pretty
In
upset
fact,
that it hasn't happened.
yes, we are, and we've spoken with people. We've spoken with people in the industry about it, and we are
So
aware
I'm just
of it.
trying to understand, it gets passed through the legislature,
Right.
probably in an all-night sitting. Maybe it was a big emergency for this government at the time to pass it through. Maybe we had to sit for 24 hours. But now here we are 3 years later and it's not proclaimed. Is that would that fall into the category of kind of regulatory concerns for your office? That seems bizarre to me that you pass a piece of legislation and then just sit on it. I don't understand why they would do that.
Well, I don't know, to be honest with you, the answer to that question.
But you just know that it hasn't been proclaimed.
I just-
and you know that industry
And I know
has,
there's an issue.
industry has a lot of angst over it.
Yes, I know that, and we've given advice on it. Yes.
Okay.
I know those things. Yeah.
Okay, but you can't say whether the advice was as simple as you should really proclaim this, you shouldn't
Well, I
dangle
think-
industry along for
I think
3 years on something.
I think it would go beyond what I can legitimately discuss here.
Okay. I don't know. I guess it presumably, I can't ask you for your opinion on legislation being passed in the legislature and then 3 years later not being proclaimed. Do you have a general opinion
Well,
on that?
I think there may be, it depends on, I would have thought it depends on the circumstances. It may be that, and I'm not talking about this case, but the concept of passing legislation and not proclaiming it, it's not unheard of, obviously. It may be that there is a second thought. The power to reserve on proclamation is there for a reason, which is the government presumably wants to have the ability to withhold implementation until such time as the circumstances are right, and maybe the circumstances change. I really, it's.
So this would speak to the very high level of dissatisfaction that business owners feel with government. It would speak exactly to a business owner and Nova Scotians' ability to trust a government, because it's been passed in the legislature.
Right.
If they don't want to proclaim it, it's terrible to string a whole entire industry along for that amount of time. Maybe we'll leave it at that. I guess it's probably I would say exhibit A, B, or C, but I'll probably be down to exhibit X, Y, or Z as to this government not thinking things through. And that's the only way you will pass a piece of legislation and then not proclaim it for 3 years. You didn't think it through to begin with. So I don't think that would surprise many Nova Scotians. It's probably just what happened again here. But I'm glad to hear that your office is aware of it. I know the industry is anxious for these things to be proclaimed. maybe you can use some of the power of your office to bring it to a head one way or the other. Either we're going to proclaim it or we're not. It's completely incompetent to the situation that exists with that. I will ask if you are familiar with the situation around permits for moving things on the highways, large buildings and stuff like that. And I want to ask very specifically about the process to get a permit to move a construction crane from point A to point B. That's something that I hear about. It can take weeks to get a permit. Sometimes when you're trying to move something on it, you don't really have time to wait weeks. And then it gets even more humorous, because it would be humorous if it wasn't so damaging to our economy, is that if you get a permit to move it there and move it back, but the job takes a little bit longer and you can't move it on the same day, you're back into the process of weeks to move your crane. Is this something that this is the kind of the common sense stuff that people would like to see addressed, right?
Absolutely, and that, thank you for the question. It's something that we're aware of and have been working on in terms of, at least in the area of oversized vehicles and permitting, and particularly getting coordination between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick in those areas. So Leanne, Ms. Hashey's probably better able, Mr. Chairman, to identify where that is at the moment in terms of.
Ms. Hashey.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have any additional information on that one. Mr. Crooks is right. We have been looking at the overdimension permitting between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. In terms of some of the common sense things that the business community has brought to our attention, they would be also areas that we have done work on, such as aligning the minimum wage amongst the 3 maritime provinces, aligning record keeping amongst the 3 maritime provinces, ensuring that common solicitation documents, so that a business that bids to the Nova Scotia government the forms have the same look and feel as those in New Brunswick and PEI.
So would it be fair to say that issues like these, specific issues like this, are kind of down in the weeds, and you never got down in the weeds yet in your mandate? Would that be fair?
Mr. Crooks.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I'd say we're down in the weeds. Like, this is an issue that concerns us.
Okay.
Like, this is a live issue, and quite frankly, to be honest, to be very straight up with you, when I go back to the office, I'm going to make a phone call to find out where that is, because we've had several conversations about it. I know there's a recognition in the department here, in the Department of Transportation, that this is something that I know the deputy is very focused on, wants to address. We've heard it. We've talked to a number of stakeholders about it. So I'm going to go, frankly, doesn't do in terms of my answer this morning, it doesn't do the committee much good.
Let's see if you can give me an update or update the committee, that'd be fine.
Happy to do that.
I accept that. I appreciate that.
Happy to do that.
So the Atlantic, I forget the name of the Atlantic Provinces Economic Council said if red tape can be reduced by 10%, could increase the GDP of Atlantic Canada by $1 billion. That's the Atlantic.
That's only maritime.
Okay, maritime.
That that was before.
Can you fine tune that a little more? What's the Nova Scotia number? Do you have a sense of what the Nova Scotia number is? And you mentioned the red tape in the province could be in 200 million. That's the cost of red tape.
Right.
But what's the positive impact of that if we can reduce red tape? Now we're talking about the increase in economic activity. It might not be something that's looked at, so I'm just curious if it is.
I don't know that they break it down in their report, but I mean, I'm sure it is. I'm sure that number is available.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to
respond.
I don't have that off the top of my head, Mr. Houston.
The 25 million target
Yes.
for red tape reduction, I don't know so you wouldn't have the corresponding side of, well, if we can achieve this target and reduce red tape by 25 million, we're probably going to increase GDP by X dollars. It might not be something that was looked at.
No, we don't. It wasn't looked at.
Okay.
To be honest with you,
Okay.
but we can ask the question if it's
Okay.
as you know, trying to link. APEC has done it at a very macro level. Trying to link specific measures at the more micro level to changes in GDP is pretty tough science for people. But I open to at least seeing, is there over the long haul a principle here that would allow us, because frankly, we'd love it if
Yeah.
we could show.
So you would say, would it just,
Order. Sorry, time has expired. We'll move to the NDP Caucus and Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't know if I've seen it in some of the information that was provided to us, but just for the committee's knowledge, what's the annual cost to taxpayers for the office? What's the annual budget?
6 million.
1.6 million. Did you request? I know I probably won't get the answer to this, but did you request an increase in the budget that we'll see next Friday, next
Yeah.
Thursday?
I'm under, I'm a novice to government, but one thing I'm under strict instructions about is talking about anything to do with the budget, which I guess makes sense.
I'll keep trying. I know
Yeah.
that we'll have to wait a week.
I will say this, that the 1.6 million annualized in the year past doesn't include the cost of the navigation pilot. That was, so I think the navigation pilot for the period of time, which it came into effect January 1, was something in the order of 100,000. But I'd have to check that number.
How many FTEs do you have?
We have eight sort of permanent FTEs. And we have, while this pilot is a one-year pilot, there are 4 FTEs associated with that pilot.
Okay.
But the pilot's 1 year, and if the pilot stops at a pilot, that's it.
So four in the navigation to the pilot, right? Okay.
Right.
And that's 1 year, is that January to January?
Right.
So if it was going to be continued, then we may see that in the upcoming budget?
If it
You
was
would
going
have
to
to
be,
address it, right?
if it was going to be continued beyond the end of January, well, the only thing, again, I don't know what's in the budget, to be honest with you, but I can say this, that on the pilot, we will be, we're gathering data on the pilot, and we will be until probably September, October, and that's the point at which we'd be making a decision as to whether the pilot should continue.
Okay.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, in your first annual report, I know, reading through the news release from CNS, you had indicated that the year ahead, the office will focus on introducing measurements and target settings to reduce regulatory burdens on services and improvements around regulations. Wouldn't those measurements, and the targets, wouldn't they have been something that would have been there on the outset, like at the start of the office? Or could you just clarify maybe that statement?
It's a good question. When we started, we had no baseline, really. We really had to, so what we decided to do was to say, okay, the first thing we know that measurement, some form of measurement is key to accountability. And there are a variety of measurement tools. Different jurisdictions do it different ways. Some jurisdictions count regulations and say we're going to reduce the count by X%. Some jurisdictions have government prepare, public service prepare estimates of what they believe are the hours spent on compliance and then produce an estimate that way. We thought the most meaningful thing to do was to choose a method which was a reliable, that both our stakeholders and the public service thought was a reliable model for estimating cost to businesses through a regulatory, the introduction of a new regulation. So we had to spend some time getting that designed. That took a fair amount of time to get that designed, but that was key infrastructure that was number one, deciding what the measure should be. So in other words, dollars, not numbers of regulations to be counted, not numbers of hours estimated by public service, but dollars actually incurred or estimated to be incurred rather, by businesses based in part on business input. So with that's the kind of the measure. Now the target was something, getting to the target, which the target was announced at $25 million in reduction by the Minister of Finance. Getting to the target took some time. We wanted the benefit of some experience in the job in actually doing reductions. We wanted to see, what kind of pace we could reasonably expect to achieve in terms of doing reductions. Where are the sort of biggest opportunities? What do our stakeholders identify and consider to be the main pain points? And so putting all that together, we got to the point where we were comfortable making a recommendation as to what both what an appropriate measurement would be, which is dollars of estimated cost, and a target of $25 million, which is what's been. So I know what you mean. Wouldn't you start with a, but we thought there was some underlying preparatory work and some analytical work that needed to be done in the first year to put us in a position to do something that would be, I mean,
Will we see more of a list in the update in June on on the
you'll see
to support the $25 million target? Okay.
Yes.
So what's the relationship or dialogue with municipalities around the province? They have their own rules, bylaws, permits, permit requirements, and I know often there is duplication. So what kind of dialogue or relationship do you have with the municipalities around Nova Scotia?
I would say strong, but we've got more work to do. Strong and aligned, I would say, in HRM, and evolving through UNSM with the other municipalities. And we have not had any pushback. I think what we've heard from some municipalities outside Halifax is, look, how do we sign on? Because we'd like to participate, and so we're following up on that. But I think the attitude is not, okay, well, that's the province doing this and we want to do our own thing at all. I think the reaction is, and there's support in the particularly in some of those municipalities on the part of the local chambers with our work, because we've got strong relationships with the local chambers. I think the perception is good, the feeling is good, and the relationship, we want to strengthen it. We want to expand our reach, but positive, I would say. And the other part of this that we haven't really looked at, I probably should, I know you didn't ask about this, but there are two aspects of municipal regulation that where we can be focused. One is, how can we work together with existing, provincial and municipal regulations to make them more seamless? The other thing does provincial regulation hamstring municipalities in some areas where, if they were freed up, they could do more in terms of promoting the local business climate? So that's something else that we're thinking about.
Are you compiling duplicate regulations? Are you identifying them, and if so, or if not, why not? If so, how are you dealing with the municipalities? Are you trying to come to an understanding that one of the parties stands down or backs away and allows the other to continue on, or how have you done that, or is that something you're? No,
to be honest with you, we haven't compiled lists of duplicate regulations, and in fact, we've got a sort of a 5-year mandate with a 3-year evaluation point. I could safely say, looking at the experience in other jurisdictions, I could safely say that a body like this, a body like our office, if the 4 Atlantic provinces and the municipalities, if this became sustained and serious, there's 15, 20 years of work here to get all of that, to get to that level where we're eliminating every area of duplication. But I think what we're focused on at the start of the relationship is, are we recognizing that service is a big part of regulatory burden? Are we handling our business customers in a coordinated way so that we're saving them time, which in turn can be measured in terms of reduction of burden? So that's kind of our starting point. But would I like to be able to, same as the total provincial burden. We haven't costed the total provincial burden because we want to, but that's a major exercise. Britain spent, I think, 20 billion pounds doing that in the United Kingdom. Europe spent more than that again. So the other thing we're trying to balance here, not to apologize for not getting on with some of these things, we're trying to balance getting the right work priorities, but not inventing something that's so big in scope in terms of the bureaucracy that it's more expensive than is sensible for a jurisdiction the size of Nova Scotia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. We'll move back to the Liberal caucus and Ms. Lonis Croft.
I just would like to go back to Ms. Hache to talk a little bit more about the regional initiatives. We were sort of cut off there, but I'd like to hear more about that. And you were about to give us an example, but I just want to know, does the apprenticeship qualifications for the banking hours and whatnot, is that all part of your work too, or?
Ms. Hache?
Thank you for the question. That specific piece was done by the apprenticeship agency.
Through the labor and
That's
advanced
right.
education, so it had nothing to do with your department. Okay, but can you follow through with the
Yeah,
example you were about to give?
Yeah, absolutely.
Earlier?
So, and my apologies for not watching time last time. So where I was at was just the challenge some of our businesses face in our province and our region in accessing those new markets, which we need our businesses to do if we want them to grow. So what the APEC report outlined was a business in Lunenburg, if they wanted to access the Atlantic market, which in totality is 2.2 million, they would need to go through 4 different provincial sets of rules and regulations to access that market. Contrast or place that business now in Kingston, Ontario. That business in Kingston, Ontario can access a market 6 times the size of our entire Atlantic market and only go through 1 provincial standards of rules and regulations. So in essence, what APEC said was that our businesses, by our pure size, are at a competitive disadvantage relative to businesses, their competitors, in our other parts of the country. So that is the underlying why. Why are we tackling this at a regional level? So to your question, how do we identify what areas we work on as a region? And if you think regulatory reform in one province is tough, try doing it with 4 jurisdictions. It's very tough, important, but very tough work. In terms of identifying priorities, we're very fortunate that APEC provided a path for the highest priority areas. As we've mentioned, we have a limited mandate, time frame to make a difference. We're very focused on making a difference and achieving results. And they said if you could focus on strategic areas like transportation, or those parts of the economy that impact all businesses, whether you're a construction company or whether you're a retail operation. Those would be workers' compensation, labor standards, labor mobility. So those are the areas that we focused on. So we focused on transportation. How it works is we get input from the business community. So on transportation, coming back to the carrier profile, we had a team of business stakeholders identify transportation as a critical area. Then we said to them, in transportation, there are probably 1,000 different areas that we could work on as a region. Name one that we could tackle. So they talked about their carrier profile, that report card, to allow trucking to move more freely within our region. We developed a team of interprovincial folks in the 4 Atlantic provinces who are experts in their area and said, can you develop a plan for how we can standardize that carrier profile. So that's essentially how the systems, how the regional initiatives are developed. So from outside input from the business community, because again, there is no point in us doing our work if it's not informed by the business community and if it doesn't have an impact on the business community. But the experts to find the way through live within government. So it's teams of interprovincial folks in the area of transportation, in labor standards, in workers' compensation, in procurement, that identify 1 or 2 or 3 things in those strategic areas that they can work on and move forward.
Okay, and so the Premier's role in the regional initiatives is?
Yes, so we've been, I'll start, and then we've been working this through the Council of Atlantic Premiers. Again, coming back to the Broughton Report, and the Broughton Report talking about the importance of leadership at the very top. The Council of Atlantic Premiers has been our vehicle to move some of these things forward.
So do you see good leadership? Or is that opinion?
Mr. Crooks.
Mr. Chairman, one of the things, I think we've mentioned this, that's key, critically key to an initiative like this having success is leadership at the top. And for Nova Scotia and the other provinces, that means the premiers. And we think we've seen very strong leadership from the 4 premiers in driving this agenda forward. And it would not work without that shared commitment. And the interesting, one of the interesting things about this is we thought that we would, you put 4 technical teams together from different provinces. Our expectation was that this is just going to be, a bit of a nuisance and a job of work for them, not their day job, whether they're in the departments of labor or transportation or whatever. The feedback we've gotten from the public servants who are working together with their colleagues in other departments is, hey, we actually, as we've said, look, should we lighten up on you? Frankly, I mean, you probably want to break from this stuff. We know it feels like chipping away at an iceberg. And the reaction was, we should be doing more of this. We learn a lot from each other, and there isn't, this is a really good opportunity. We should be doing more of this kind of work. So, which is really encouraging to hear, because where you're trying to drive a little bit of change, to get that kind of buy-in from the people who are working around the table is so important.
Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it on to my colleague.
Mr. Stroink.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your time today, and I quite enjoyed your presentation. I guess what I kind of wanted to touch base on was that the CFIB has been brought up in the discussion here on a negative context. So I guess what I'm trying to get at here is where do we sit in Canada with small business, on the small business barometer that they put forward, that the CFIB put forward?
Well, first of all, I assume you're referring to their report card.
Yep.
We have we're at a B. We are, I believe Quebec and BC are at A. And I think that, I don't know, I'd have to refresh my memory, but I think that we're in the 3rd rank.
Yeah, top 3.
We're in the top 3. So now, just on that grade, I don't know, none of us when we're in school would like to have a B when we think we prefer to have an A.
Yeah.
We're not going to be, we don't live and die by those scores. We directionally, we've got a very strong relationship with CFIB, a very productive relationship, we feel. We started at I think a D minus.
Yep.
And then we went to a C minus, Leanne reminds me, and now we're at a B. And one of the major things that CFIB said in terms of continued progress was a target that reflects an appropriate measurement mechanism. So, we're very, we're type A's, so to speak. We'd like to have an A fast, but we're pleased both at the direction of the grading and their evaluation. They're an important stakeholder, and at the collaboration between the two.
So that 25 million target that we're setting for, and I guess before I ask that question, I guess what I'm trying to use as CFIB seems to be the national standard of business confidence for small businesses. Like, I was a member for 20 years. They do a phenomenal job
Yes.
at kind of analyzing
I
and
would agree.
yeah, and identifying the issues that are key within Nova Scotia and straight across Canada. So my question really quickly, because I do want to follow up with another one, is what is that $25 million? Will that help us get to the A? Do you think that's that hard target that we've created with anecdotal remarks or anecdotal targets?
Again, I can't speak for CFIB.
No,
They run their own
realize that.
mechanism. But if you're asking my view is yes, that should contribute to a better overall evaluation.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at too, is that without the leadership of the Premier, we would not be able to get to those confidence within small businesses. And the small business community as a whole, from what I've heard in my time, 12 years as being a small business owner, that the confidence is feeling better within Nova Scotia in the sense of the regulatory review. Having that ability for HRM now to be part of the conversation, because they own 50% of the regulatory problems that are there. My biggest pet peeve is the encroachments of signage for small businesses. But what I really want to get down to is what your work does and what all MLAs do. I've used your department on numerous occasions with small business regulatory affairs, and I think that elected officials need to understand that you're there to help them in their communities to figure out the regulatory. And I just want to, if you could just explain that, how that's worked, and our relationship's been great, and how that can benefit them.
We feel very, we want to be open to helping people who have questions or people who are representing people who have questions, and often MLAs are the first to hear about a regulatory issue or some constraint. And we've tried to be open. We've responded to requests from MLAs. I was about to say we'd love to have more, but that's probably saying we'd love to have more problems identified. But it's a really important potential channel, especially of communication with our office, especially now that we have our navigation system. So, to the extent that the question is, are we open to working closely with MLAs? We absolutely are. We welcome that. It would help us. Frankly, it would help us do a better job.
Excellent. And I think that's kind of what I was trying to lean at, is that the 3 or 4 times that I've used you and just sent you an email this morning on another issue, those are the things that I think makes a better business climate, and identifying them and identifying them from the experts. So thank you. I think that's all my time anyways.
Thank you, Mr. Stroink. Mr. Crooks, we'll allow you a brief moment to provide some closing comments.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Given my negligence in going overtime at the beginning, I won't burden you with anything further at the end, save to say, look, I really have appreciated the opportunity to hear from members and interact with members. Frankly, this has been helpful to us. Some of your questions are things that we're going to take away and think about. I think this is a very constructive and useful exercise, and I'm pleased and honored, and I know I speak for Leanne in saying pleased and honored to be part of it, and feel free to be in touch with us on any question touching business, small or large. We welcome the opportunity. So thank you very much for having us in.
Thank you for being with us. We do have some committee business. We had some correspondence from the Department of Health and Wellness and the Nova Scotia Health Authority. There was information that was requested on the March 8th meeting, during that meeting, and you have that before you. Are there any questions? Hearing none, we have another piece of correspondence also from the Department of Health and Wellness listing health infrastructure projects. Any questions on that correspondence? Hearing none. We do have a record of decision, which I believe is before everyone. This was from our subcommittee meeting on agenda and procedures this morning. There are a number of topics that have been approved by the subcommittee. There are a couple at the bottom that I'm going to ask the Auditor General for some advice, because they are topics related to audits that office has completed. One is the Atlantic Lottery Corporation, joint audit of that, and the second is critical infrastructure resiliency, which was Chapter 4 of the November 2016 report. And I'd like to ask Mr. Pickup now if he could recommend witnesses for those for the committee's consideration. Mr. Pickup.
Sure, thank you. For the Atlantic Lottery Corporation, I would recommend 3 individuals, and I'll tell you why. Firstly, I would recommend the Chief Executive Officer, Brent Scrimshaw, because he would handle a lot of the observations and the recommendations that we make concerning operations. Secondly, I would recommend the Chair of the Board, Sean O'Connor, because a number of the observations and recommendations were at that board level. And finally, I would recommend the Deputy Minister of Communities, Cultures and Heritage. They are the lead department on behalf of government, and a number of the recommendations based on observations related to the government and governance. So I would recommend those 3 parties on the Atlantic Lottery Corp. On the critical infrastructure resiliency, I would also recommend 3 people. And it follows, again, out of the observations and recommendations. Firstly, I would recommend the clerk of the Executive Council. The number 1 recommendation from that audit went to the Executive Council in terms of recommending somebody being in charge. Secondly, I would recommend the Deputy Minister of Municipal Affairs in her capacity as head of EMO. 80% of the recommendations in that audit went to EMO. And she would be in charge of that. And finally, on that one, I would recommend the DM of Transportation, because a number of the operational observations that we had, whether it was things like the Canso Causeway or the Amherst Link, fall under the area of transportation. So those are the 3 that I would recommend from that audit.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup. And are members okay with the recommendation? I'm hearing agreement. So to the broader list, are there any questions or comments before we put the record of decision to a vote? Hearing none, all those in favor of the topics approved by the subcommittee earlier this morning, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion is carried. Our clerk will take note of that. Our next meeting is on Mr. Houston.
Thank you. Just with the topics approved, there's quite a range of topics there. I just wonder if we do have an open date on the 26th next week. I just wonder, it would be a shame to let that open date go unused when we have all this committee business to do. I just wonder if maybe we can ask the clerk to see if one of those witnesses could appear before the committee next week.
Thank you, Mr. Houston. And you're correct, we don't have a meeting scheduled for next week. We can ask our clerk to proceed to see if a witness might be available for next week. Is the committee in favor of that? All those in favor? Those opposed? Our clerk will take note of that and will attempt to gain a witness for next week. And if that is possible, she will notify us by email, and if there are any questions, please contact the clerk or myself. Is there any further business to come before the committee? Hearing none, unless there is a meeting that is scheduled for next week, our next meeting would be May 3rd, and that would be on school capital planning, which is Chapter 2 of the Auditor General's November 2016 report. And we would have a briefing from 8:30 to 9 that morning, and then the public meeting from 9 to 11. With that, this meeting is adjourned.